The morning mist hung thick over the Montana ranch as Tom Harrison stepped into his stable, coffee mug in hand, expecting nothing more than the usual routine of feeding his horses. What he found instead would change 4 lives forever and challenge everything he thought he knew about family, sacrifice, and the lengths a mother will go to protect her children. In a world where headlines scream of division and mistrust, this is the story of how strangers became family, how desperation led to hope, and how sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin with the most unexpected discoveries. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning would become a testament to the power of human compassion that crossed language barriers, cultural differences, and social expectations to create something extraordinary. The sound that stopped Tom in his tracks wasn't the familiar whinny of horses or the rustle of hay. It was something far more precious and infinitely more fragile. The soft crying of babies where no babies should be. But this story isn't just about the discovery. It's about what happened next, when a weathered rancher, a desperate mother, and 2 innocent children found themselves thrown together by circumstances none of them could have imagined. It's about the choices we make when life presents us with situations that don't fit neatly into the categories we've created for ourselves, and how sometimes the most profound acts of love come from the most unlikely sources. Tom Harrison had been running his ranch in the rolling hills of Montana for 37 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the land and life could throw at him. Droughts that lasted 3 seasons, winters so harsh they claimed half his cattle, market crashes that nearly bankrupted him twice, and the slow, aching loss of his wife Sarah to cancer 5 years prior. At 62, his weathered hands told the story of every sunrise he'd greeted, every fence he'd mended, every animal he'd helped bring into the world or laid to rest. His routine was as predictable as the seasons themselves, and that Tuesday morning in early October started no differently than the thousands that had come before it. The alarm clock beside his bed buzzed at 5:30, just as it had every morning for decades. Tom's feet hit the cold hardwood floor of his modest farmhouse with the same deliberate pace, his joints protesting the early hour with familiar aches. He shuffled to the kitchen, started the coffee pot that had been a wedding gift from Sarah's mother 40 years ago, and stared out the window at the stable that housed his 6 horses. The morning mist clung to the ground like a soft gray blanket, and the first hints of autumn painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Coffee in hand, Tom pulled on his worn leather jacket and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way across the yard toward the stable, mentally running through the day's tasks. The fence in the north pasture needed attention, the hay delivery was coming Thursday, and he had to call the veterinarian about his mare Bella, who'd been favoring her left front leg. These thoughts occupied his mind as he approached the stable door, the same door he'd opened thousands of times before. But something was different this morning. As Tom reached for the heavy wooden door handle, he paused. There was a sound coming from inside the stable that didn't belong, a soft whimpering that wasn't quite animal but wasn't quite right either. He'd spent his entire life around horses and cattle, and he knew every sound they made. This was something else entirely. Tom's weathered hand froze on the door handle as he listened more carefully, his heart beginning to beat just a little faster. The sound came again, clearer this time, and Tom's breath caught in his throat. It was crying. Not the distressed neighing of a horse or the lowing of cattle, but the unmistakable sound of babies crying. Human babies. Tom stood motionless for a long moment, wondering if his ears were playing tricks on him, if perhaps he was still asleep, and this was some strange dream brought on by too much solitude and too many years of living alone. But when he heard it a third time, accompanied by what sounded like a woman's voice speaking softly in a language he didn't recognize, Tom knew this was no dream. His hands trembled slightly as he slowly pulled open the stable door, not knowing what he would find on the other side, but understanding instinctively that whatever it was would change everything. The stable was dim in the early morning light, shafts of golden sunlight streaming through the gaps in the wooden walls and creating patterns of light and shadow on the hay-covered floor. Tom's eyes took a moment to adjust, but when they did, he saw something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the predictable rhythm of his life. There, in the far corner of the stable, nestled in a pile of fresh hay beside his gentlest mare Daisy, was a young Asian woman holding 2 small bundles close to her chest. The woman looked up at Tom with eyes that held a mixture of terror and desperate hope. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with long black hair that hung in tangled strands around her face. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and it was clear she had been traveling for some time. But it was her eyes that struck Tom most profoundly. They were the clouded, unfocused eyes of someone who could not see, yet they seemed to look right through him to his soul. The bundles she held so protectively were two babies, twins from the look of them, wrapped in what appeared to be torn pieces of fabric and clothing. They couldn't have been more than a few months old, and their small faces were red from crying and cold. The woman spoke again in her unfamiliar language, her voice urgent and pleading. And though Tom couldn't understand her words, he understood her desperation perfectly. For a long moment, the rancher and the young mother stared at each other across the stable. Two people from completely different worlds brought together by circumstances neither could have imagined. Tom's mind raced with questions. How had she gotten here? Where had she come from? How long had she been traveling with these babies? Was she in danger? Was she running from something or someone? But even as these questions flooded his thoughts, Tom's instincts as a man who had spent his life caring for vulnerable creatures kicked in. He could see that the woman was exhausted, probably hungry, and certainly afraid. The babies needed warmth and food, and whatever circumstances had brought this small family to his stable in the middle of nowhere, they clearly needed help. Tom slowly raised his hands, palms out, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The woman tensed, pulling the babies closer to her chest. But she didn't try to run. Where could she run to anyway, blind and alone, with two infants in the middle of rural Montana? Tom spoke softly, his voice low and calm the way he'd speak to a spooked horse. It's okay, he said, though he knew she probably couldn't understand him. I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe here. He repeated the words slowly, hoping that his tone would convey what his words could not. The woman tilted her head slightly, listening to his voice, and Tom thought he saw some of the tension leave her shoulders. One of the babies began to cry again, a thin, hungry wail that echoed off the stable walls. The woman began to rock gently, murmuring to the child in her native language, but it was clear that she was at the end of her resources. Tom could see that she was shivering, whether from cold or exhaustion or fear, he couldn't tell. Probably all three. Without taking his eyes off the woman and her babies, Tom slowly backed toward the stable door. He held up one hand, hoping she would understand that he was telling her to wait, that he would return. The woman watched him go with those unseeing eyes, and Tom wondered how someone who could not see could seem so aware of everything around her. Tom's mind was spinning as he hurried back to the house. In all his years, through all the challenges and surprises life had thrown at him, he was a simple rancher, a man more comfortable with animals than with people, especially people who didn't speak his language. He had no experience with babies, no knowledge of how to help a desperate mother and her children. But as he reached his kitchen and began gathering supplies, Tom realized that experience and knowledge weren't what mattered here. What mattered was doing what was right, what was human, what Sarah would have expected of him if she were still alive. His wife had always been the one with the soft heart, the one who took in stray cats and helped neighbors in need. Tom had always been more practical, more focused on the business of running the ranch. But standing in his kitchen, loading a basket with bottles of water, crackers, and a warm blanket, Tom felt Sarah's presence as strongly as if she was standing beside him. He paused at the kitchen window, looking back toward the stable where 3 lives hung in the balance of whatever decision he made next. The sun was rising higher now, burning off the morning mist, and Tom knew that soon the outside world would begin to stir. Other ranchers would be starting their morning routines, delivery trucks would begin traveling the county roads, and the isolation that had protected this strange encounter would begin to fade. Tom grabbed a thermos and filled it with hot coffee, then added a container of the soup he'd made the night before. As an afterthought, he went to the linen closet and pulled out more blankets. Baby blankets that had belonged to the children he and Sarah had never been able to have. They'd kept them all these years, just in case, and now it seemed like maybe there had been a reason. When Tom returned to the stable, the woman was exactly where he had left her, but now both babies were crying. She looked up as he entered, and he could see the relief in her expression, even though she couldn't see him clearly. Tom set the basket down within her reach, and then slowly backed away, giving her space while making it clear that the supplies were for her. The woman reached carefully for the basket, her hands exploring its contents. When her fingers found the warm thermos, she gasped softly and looked up in Tom's direction. She spoke again in her language, and though he couldn't understand her words, he could hear the gratitude in her voice. She managed to drink some of the coffee while still holding the babies, and the color began to return to her face. As Tom watched this young mother tend to her children with supplies from his kitchen, using blankets that had waited 40 years for babies to warm, he realized that this morning had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The predictable rhythm of his solitary life had been broken, and there was no going back to the way things were. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges lay ahead, Tom Harrison was no longer just a rancher living alone on the Montana plains. He was now part of something larger, something more complicated, and something infinitely more important than anything he had ever done before. The woman looked up at him again, and this time, when she spoke, Tom heard something different in her voice. It was still urgent, still pleading, but there was also determination there, and hope. She was trying to tell him something important. And Tom wished desperately that he could understand. But as he watched her struggle to communicate, holding her babies close, while reaching toward him with words he couldn't grasp, Tom realized that understanding would come. It would have to come. Because whatever had brought this small family to his stable, whatever story had led to this moment, it was now his story too. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the stable floor, and Tom Harrison stood at the threshold of a new chapter in his life, one that would test everything he thought he knew about family, responsibility, and the unexpected ways that love can find us when we least expect it. The rest of that first morning passed in a careful dance of gestures, half-understood communications, and growing mutual trust. Tom found himself moving more slowly than usual, not wanting to startle the young woman who had made his stable her sanctuary. He brought more supplies throughout the morning, a cushion for her to sit on, more food, and clean cloths that might serve as diapers for the babies. Each time he approached, she watched him with those remarkable eyes that seemed to see so much despite their cloudiness. By noon, Tom had managed to learn the woman's name through a combination of pointing to himself and saying Tom repeatedly until she understood and responded with Li Wei. The babies, he learned through similar gestures, were called Ming and Mei, though he wasn't sure he was pronouncing the names correctly. Li Wei seemed patient with his attempts, even managing small smiles when he particularly mangled the pronunciation of her children's names. It was during one of these attempts at communication that Tom realized Li Wei wasn't completely blind. When he held up 2 fingers and then pointed to the babies, she squinted and seemed to focus on his hand with great concentration before nodding and holding up 2 fingers of her own. Her vision was severely impaired, but she had some sight, enough to make out shapes and movements in good light. As the day wore on, Tom found himself staying in the stable longer during each visit, sitting on a hay bale a respectful distance away and watching Li Wei care for her children. Despite her obvious exhaustion and the dire circumstances, she was a devoted mother. She sang to the babies in soft Chinese lullabies, spoke to them constantly in her native language, and seemed to anticipate their needs with an intuition that impressed Tom. He had raised many animals on his ranch, but watching Li Wei with her children reminded him that there was something uniquely profound about the bond between a mother and her babies. The babies themselves were beautiful children, with dark hair and bright, curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around them despite their young age. Ming, Tom learned, was slightly larger and more vocal, while Mei was quieter, but more alert to her surroundings. They couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 months old, and Tom marveled at how Li Wei had managed to care for them during whatever journey had brought them here. As afternoon turned to evening, Tom faced his first major decision since discovering his unexpected guests. The temperature was dropping, and while the stable provided some shelter, it wasn't suitable for a mother and 2 infants to spend the night, especially with more cold weather predicted for the coming days. But bringing them into his house felt like crossing a line that would make their presence impossible to hide and would raise questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. Tom had always been a law-abiding man, someone who respected authority and followed proper procedures. The logical thing to do would be to contact the authorities to report that he had found what were obviously undocumented immigrants on his property. But every time he looked at Li Wei holding her children, every time he saw the trust beginning to grow in her eyes, he found himself unable to reach for his phone. Instead, as darkness began to fall, Tom made his decision. He approached Li Wei slowly, gesturing toward the house and speaking in the calm, reassuring tone he'd been using all day. "Come," he said, pointing toward his home. "House. Warm. Safe." He repeated the words and gestures until Li Wei seemed to understand. She looked uncertain, glancing around the stable as if it had become a refuge she was reluctant to leave. Tom understood her hesitation. The stable was open, with multiple exits, and it was where she had felt safe enough to rest. His house was enclosed, unfamiliar, and represented a level of trust she might not be ready to give. But when one of the babies began to cry, and she pulled the thin blanket tighter around them, Tom saw her resolve weaken. She needed warmth for her children more than she needed the illusion of safety that the stable provided. Slowly, carefully, Li Wei gathered the babies and the few possessions she had with her and stood up. She swayed slightly, and Tom realized she was weaker than she'd been letting on. He stepped forward instinctively to steady her, and though she tensed at the contact, she didn't pull away. Together, they made their way slowly across the yard toward the house, Li Wei's hand resting lightly on Tom's arm as he guided her through the darkness. Tom's farmhouse was simple but comfortable, a reflection of 40 years of life with Sarah and 5 years of solitary existence since her death. He led Li Wei to the living room, where a stone fireplace dominated one wall and comfortable furniture arranged for practicality rather than style. Tom quickly built a fire while Li Wei settled onto the couch with her babies, her eyes taking in as much of her new surroundings as her limited vision allowed. The warmth of the fire seemed to melt some of the tension Li Wei had been carrying, and for the first time since Tom had found her, she truly relaxed. The babies, too, seemed to sense the change in their environment, and their crying subsided as they nestled against their mother in the warm room. Tom busied himself in the kitchen, heating soup and making sandwiches, though he wasn't sure what Li Wei would be able to eat. When he returned to the living room with a tray of food, Tom found Li Wei nursing one of the babies while the other slept in her arm. She looked up as he entered, and he saw something in her expression that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just gratitude or relief, but a kind of peace, as if for the first time in a long while she felt truly safe. They ate together in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft murmuring Li Wei made to her children. Tom found himself studying this young woman who had appeared so suddenly in his life, trying to piece together the story that had brought her here. Her clothes, though dirty and torn, were of good quality. Her hands were soft, not the hands of someone accustomed to hard physical labor. She carried herself with a dignity that spoke of education and breeding, despite her current circumstances. After dinner, Tom showed Li Wei to the guest bedroom that had once been intended as a nursery, but had instead become storage for extra linens and Sarah's sewing projects. He quickly cleared a space and made up the bed with fresh sheets and extra pillows to create a safe sleeping area for the babies. Li Wei explored the room carefully, her hands trailing along the walls and furniture, mapping the space in her mind. As Tom prepared to leave her to rest, Li Wei caught his arm gently. She spoke to him in Chinese, her voice earnest and emotional, and though he couldn't understand her words, her meaning was clear. She was thanking him, not just for the food and shelter, but for seeing her as a human being deserving of help, rather than as a problem to be dealt with. That night, Tom lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of a mother and her babies settling in down the hall. The house felt different with their presence, alive in a way it hadn't been since Sarah's death. But along with the warmth their presence brought came a weight of responsibility that Tom wasn't sure he was prepared to carry. He thought about the questions that would come if anyone discovered Li Wei and her children here. His nearest neighbors lived 5 miles away, so unexpected visitors were unlikely, but the postman came twice a week, and the veterinarian was due Thursday for Bella's checkup. How long could he realistically hide the presence of 3 people in his house? And what would happen to Li Wei and her babies if he couldn't? More troubling were the questions he couldn't answer about Li Wei herself. How had she come to be traveling alone with 2 infants? Where had she come from, and why had she left? Was she running from something, or towards something? Was someone looking for her? The possibilities ranged from heartbreaking to terrifying, and Tom realized he had no way of knowing which scenario was closest to the truth. But as these worried thoughts circled through his mind, Tom kept coming back to one simple fact. Whatever Li Wei's story, whatever dangers or complications her presence might bring, she was here now, and she needed help. Her babies needed safety and warmth and food, and they needed it now, not after weeks of bureaucratic processing or immigration hearings. Tom had spent his life caring for creatures that couldn't care for themselves, and the skills that had served him well with injured animals and lost cattle seemed applicable here as well. The next morning, Tom woke to the smell of something cooking in his kitchen. He found Li Wei at his stove, carefully preparing what appeared to be a simple rice dish with vegetables she must have found in his refrigerator. She looked up when he entered, offering him a shy smile and gesturing toward the food. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and Tom was struck by how young she looked when her face wasn't drawn tight with worry and exhaustion. The babies were awake and alert, lying on a blanket Li Wei had spread on the kitchen floor. They seemed fascinated by their new surroundings, their dark eyes tracking the movement of light and shadow across the ceiling. Ming was making soft babbling sounds, as if trying to communicate with the world around him, while Mei watched everything with the intense concentration that Tom was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her personality. As they shared the simple breakfast Li Wei had prepared, Tom realized that this second morning was different from the first. Yesterday had been about immediate needs, about providing shelter and food to people in desperate circumstances. Today felt like the beginning of something more complex and long-term. Today decisions would have to be made about what came next. Li Wei seemed to sense this too. After breakfast she approached Tom with something in her hand, a small photograph that she had carefully protected during her journey. She placed it in his hands and spoke urgently in Chinese, pointing to the picture and then to herself. Tom studied the photograph, which showed a younger version of Li Wei standing with a man in what appeared to be a formal portrait. Li Wei was smiling in the picture, her eyes clear and bright, and she was obviously pregnant. Tom looked up at Li Wei, then back at the photograph, beginning to understand. The man in the picture must be the father of her children, but his absence now suggested something had happened to him. Li Wei continued speaking, her voice becoming more emotional, and though Tom couldn't understand her words, he could hear the grief and loss in her tone. As the morning progressed, Tom began to piece together more of Li Wei's story through gestures, drawings, and the few English words she was beginning to learn. She had come from somewhere far away. That much was clear from the way she pointed toward the mountains and made sweeping gestures. She had been traveling for a long time, longer than seemed possible with 2 infants, and she was looking for someone or something in America. The photograph seemed to be important to whatever search had brought her here. She pointed to the man in the picture repeatedly and made gestures that Tom interpreted as searching or looking for someone. But whether she was looking for this man specifically, or someone related to him, or perhaps running from something connected to him, Tom couldn't determine. What became increasingly clear as the day went on was that Li Wei had no intention of being a passive recipient of charity. Despite her circumstances, despite her visual impairment and the enormous challenge of caring for 2 infants alone, she was determined to contribute to the household that had taken her in. She helped with cooking and cleaning, adapting quickly to the layout of Tom's kitchen, and developing systems that allowed her to work efficiently despite her limited sight. Tom found himself amazed by Li Wei's resourcefulness and resilience. She had created a routine for caring for the babies that maximized their comfort while minimizing the disruption to Tom's household. She had figured out how to use his washing machine to keep their few clothes clean, and she had even begun attempting to communicate with his horses, speaking to them in the same gentle tone she used with her children. By the 3rd day, a new rhythm had established itself in the Harrison household. Tom went about his usual ranch duties, but now he found himself hurrying through his work to spend time with Li Wei and the babies. He brought in fresh milk from his neighbor's dairy, thinking it might be useful for Li Wei, and was touched when she showed him how to prepare a simple formula for the twins that was easier to digest than the cow's milk he had been offering. It was on this 3rd evening that Tom made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about Li Wei's situation. While she was bathing the babies in his kitchen sink, Tom was putting away the laundry she had washed when he found a small bundle of papers hidden in the pocket of her jacket. He almost put them back without looking, respecting her privacy, but something made him glance at the documents before folding the jacket. The papers were official documents, but not the kind Tom had expected. They weren't immigration papers or travel documents, but rather medical records and legal papers with official stamps and signatures. Tom couldn't read the Chinese characters, but he recognized enough English words scattered throughout the documents to understand their significance. Li Wei wasn't an undocumented immigrant trying to sneak into the country. She was a legal resident with documentation, and the medical record suggested that her visual impairment was the result of something recent and traumatic. Tom stared at the papers for a long moment, his understanding of Li Wei's situation shifting dramatically. If she was here legally, why was she hiding? Why had she been traveling alone with her babies instead of seeking help through proper channels? And what had happened to cause the injury that had damaged her sight? As these new questions swirled through his mind, Tom heard Li Wei calling his name from the kitchen. She had finished bathing the babies and was looking for him, probably wondering where he had gone. Tom quickly folded the papers and replaced them in the jacket pocket, deciding that when Li Wei was ready to share her story, she would do so in her own time and her own way. But as he returned to the kitchen and saw Li Wei holding her clean, happy babies, Tom realized that knowing she was here legally didn't make his situation any less complicated. In fact, it raised even more troubling questions about what she was running from and why someone with proper documentation would choose to hide rather than seek official help. The story behind Li Wei's presence in his stable was more complex than he had imagined, and Tom was beginning to understand that the choices he made in the coming days would have consequences that reached far beyond the boundaries of his Montana ranch. The breakthrough in communication came unexpectedly on the 6th day, through an old laptop that had belonged to Sarah. Tom had been struggling to find ways to better understand Li Wei's situation, and it occurred to him that translation software might help bridge the gap between them. When he brought the laptop to the living room, where Li Wei was playing with the babies, her reaction was immediate and intense. Li Wei's face lit up with recognition and hope as she carefully examined the computer. She spoke rapidly in Chinese, pointing to the screen and then to herself, clearly indicating that she knew how to use it. Tom helped her navigate to an online translation program, and for the first time since her arrival, Li Wei was able to communicate in complete thoughts rather than gestures and single words. The first thing she typed, her fingers moving carefully but confidently across the keyboard, was a formal thank you message that appeared in English on the screen. Mr. Tom, I cannot express my gratitude for your kindness to me and my children. You have saved our lives, and I will never forget your compassion. The formal politeness of the message told Tom much about Li Wei's education and background, confirming his impression that she came from circumstances very different from her current situation. But it was her second message that began to reveal the true complexity of her story. I know you must have many questions about why I am here and why I was hiding in your stable. I want to tell you everything, but I am afraid, not of you, but of what might happen to my children if certain people find us. Tom typed his response slowly, hunt and peck style, his own lack of computer skills now seeming trivial compared to the importance of the conversation. You are safe here. I want to help, but I need to understand your situation. Are you in some kind of danger? Li Wei's fingers hesitated over the keyboard for a long moment before she began typing her reply. The story that emerged over the next several hours was more tragic and complex than Tom had imagined, a tale of love, loss, corruption, and a mother's desperate flight to protect her children. Li Wei explained that she had been married to Chen Wei, the man in the photograph, who worked for an American technology company in Shanghai. Chen Wei had discovered evidence of corporate fraud and corruption involving millions of dollars and had tried to report it through proper channels. Instead of being protected as a whistleblower, he had been threatened and eventually killed in what was made to look like an accident. After her husband's death, Li Wei learned that she was also in danger because of what her husband had told her about the corruption he had discovered. She was followed, her home was searched, and threatening messages made it clear that she and her unborn children would not be safe if she remained in China. The stress and trauma of this period had caused complications with her pregnancy and had resulted in the partial loss of her vision. Li Wei had managed to flee China using documentation her husband had secured before his death, including papers that would allow her to seek asylum in the United States. She had contacts in America, people her husband had worked with who might be able to help her, but she had been afraid to contact them directly for fear that the corruption network had connections in America as well. The journey to America had been harrowing, made more difficult by her pregnancy and deteriorating eyesight. The babies had been born during a stopover in a transit country, under circumstances that Li Wei described only briefly, but that Tom understood had been both dangerous and traumatic. By the time she had reached the United States, Li Wei was exhausted, afraid, and unsure who she could trust. She had been traveling toward the city where her husband's American colleagues worked when her money had run out, and she had been forced to abandon the bus she had been riding. She had been walking for 2 days, carrying her babies and what few possessions she could manage, when she had collapsed in Tom's stable. She had chosen the stable not randomly, but because she had seen from the road that it was isolated, and because something about the peaceful setting had made her feel it might be safe. As Li Wei's story unfolded on the laptop screen, Tom found himself struggling to process the enormity of what she had been through. This young woman had lost her husband, her home, her health, and merely her life, all because her husband had tried to do the right thing. She had fled across the world while pregnant, given birth in circumstances Tom could barely imagine, and had spent months traveling with 2 infants while partially blind and constantly afraid for their safety. But perhaps most striking to Tom was Li Wei's resilience and determination throughout this ordeal. Despite everything she had been through, despite the trauma and loss and constant danger, she had never given up. She had found ways to survive, to protect her children, and to keep moving toward the hope of safety and justice. The strength it must have taken to endure what she had endured, while maintaining her dignity and her devotion to her children, was something Tom found both humbling and inspiring. As the scope of Li Wei's situation became clear, Tom realized that his simple act of providing shelter had inadvertently placed him in the middle of something much larger and more dangerous than he had understood. If Li Wei was telling the truth about the corruption and the threats against her family, then helping her might put him at risk as well. But as he looked at Li Wei holding her babies, at the trust in her eyes as she shared her story, Tom knew there was no decision to make. He had already chosen his path the moment he opened the stable door. Over the following days, Tom and Li Wei used the laptop to discuss practical matters as well as her personal history. Li Wei provided Tom with the contact information for her husband's colleagues in Denver, people she believed might be able to help her navigate the asylum process and potentially provide testimony about her husband's discoveries. She also shared details about the legal documentation she carried, explaining that while her presence in the country was legal, she had been afraid to use official channels because she didn't know how far the corruption network's influence extended. Tom learned that Li Wei had a degree in international business and had worked for a respected firm in Shanghai before her marriage. She spoke 3 languages fluently and had been involved in her husband's work enough to understand the significance of what he had discovered. She wasn't just a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She was an intelligent, capable woman who had been forced into an impossible situation by people who valued money over human life. As Li Wei's English improved through their conversations and her increasing confidence, Tom began to see glimpses of who she had been before tragedy had transformed her life. She had a sharp sense of humor that emerged when she felt safe, and she possessed a natural curiosity about American culture that led to long conversations about everything from farming techniques to local history. She was fascinated by Tom's stories about ranch life and showed genuine interest in learning about the care of horses and cattle. The babies, too, were thriving in the stable environment Tom's home provided. Ming and Mei were growing rapidly, developing distinct personalities that delighted both their mother and their unlikely guardian. Ming was adventurous and vocal, always eager to explore his surroundings and quick to voice his opinions about everything from feeding time to diaper changes. Mei was more contemplative, with an intense gaze that suggested she was constantly processing the world around her, but she had a ready smile for anyone who took the time to engage with her. Tom found himself falling into a routine that included not just ranch work but also helping with the babies, something he had never expected to experience. He learned to change diapers, to warm bottles, and to recognize the subtle differences between a hungry cry and a tired cry. Li Wei was patient with his efforts, though she sometimes laughed at his clumsy attempts to fold tiny clothes or his panicked reactions when both babies cried at the same time. It was during one of these domestic moments, as Tom was attempting to feed Mei while Li Wei bathed Ming, that he realized how profoundly his life had changed in just over a week. His solitary existence had been replaced by the constant presence of other people who depended on him. And instead of feeling burdened by this responsibility, he found it energizing. The house that had felt so empty after Sarah's death was alive again with voices and laughter and the ordinary chaos of daily life with small children. But this growing sense of family and normalcy was shadowed by the knowledge that their situation was temporary and potentially dangerous. Li Wei's legal status was complicated, and her safety remained uncertain. The longer she stayed on the ranch, the greater the chance that someone would discover her presence, and Tom wasn't sure what the consequences of that discovery might be for any of them. The decision about what to do next came to a head when Tom's veterinarian, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, called to reschedule her visit to examine Bella. Dr. Walsh mentioned that she had heard rumors in town about unusual activity at various properties in the area, reports of strangers passing through, and federal agents asking questions about undocumented immigrants. The news made Tom's stomach tighten with anxiety, and he realized that their window of safety might be closing. That evening, Tom and Li Wei had their most serious conversation yet about the future. Using the laptop, they discussed the risks of contacting her husband's colleagues, the possibility of moving to a safer location, and the complex process of seeking official asylum protection. Li Wei was torn between her desire to pursue justice for her husband's death and her need to ensure her children's safety, and Tom could see the weight of these impossible choices in every line of her face. It was Li Wei who ultimately made the decision that would shape their next steps. She typed a long message that appeared on the screen in careful, formal English.
Mr. Wavering?
Tom, I cannot continue to put you at risk by hiding here. You have given me something I had lost hope of finding. Proof that there are still good people in the world who will help strangers without expecting anything in return. But I must take responsibility for my situation and my children's future. I want to contact my husband's colleagues and begin the process of seeking protection through official channels. If they cannot help me, or if it proves too dangerous, then I will find another way. But I will not continue to endanger your safety or impose on your kindness. Tom read her message twice before typing his response, his fingers moving more smoothly across the keyboard after days of practice. Li Wei, you and the children are not imposing on my kindness. You are part of my family now, and families don't abandon each other when things get difficult. If you want to contact your husband's colleagues, then we will do it together. If you need to seek official protection, then we will find a way to do it safely. But you will not face this alone unless that is what you truly want. As Li Wei read Tom's message, tears began to stream down her face. She looked up at him, her damaged eyes bright with emotion, and spoke aloud in English for the first time since her arrival. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with accent but clear with meaning. "Thank you for giving us home when we had nowhere to go." That night, as Tom lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of Li Wei settling the babies for sleep, he reflected on how much his understanding of family had expanded in just over a week. He had spent years mourning the children he and Sarah had never had, feeling as though their childless home was incomplete. Now he realized that family wasn't just about blood relations or legal documents. It was about choosing to care for each other, about opening your heart to people who needed what you had to offer, about building connections that transcended the boundaries society created. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight Tom Harrison fell asleep to the sound of babies breathing peacefully in the next room and their mother's soft voice singing Chinese lullabies. For the first time in 5 years, his house felt like a home again, and whatever came next, Tom knew he would face it with the determination of a man who had finally found his purpose in protecting the family that had found its way to his door. The phone call that changed everything came at 7 in the morning on a Thursday, 3 days after Li Wei had decided to contact her husband's colleagues in Denver. Tom was in the kitchen preparing bottles for the twins when his landline rang with an urgency that made his heart race even before he heard the voice on the other end. "Mr. Dalmere?" "Harrison, this is Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI. We need to speak with you immediately about some individuals who may have sought shelter on your property. We're on our way to your location now and should arrive within the hour." Tom's hands shook as he set down the phone, his mind racing with implications he didn't want to consider. Li Wei appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding Ming while Mei slept in the carrier strapped to her chest. Her limited vision hadn't prevented her from sensing the tension in Tom's voice during the brief conversation, and her face was already tight with worry. "What is wrong?" she asked in the careful English she had been practicing, though her accent made the words sound more like a statement than a question. Tom looked at this brave young woman who had trusted him with her life and her children's lives, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just Li Wei's fate, but the fate of 2 innocent babies who had done nothing wrong except be born to a father who had tried to expose corruption. Using the laptop that had become their primary means of complex communication, Tom quickly typed, "The FBI is coming. They know about you. We need to decide right now what we're going to do." Li Wei's face went pale as she read the message, and for a moment Tom thought she might collapse. But instead she straightened her shoulders in a gesture of determination he had come to recognize, and began typing her response with the steady fingers of someone who had faced impossible choices before. "I will not run anymore. If they have found me, then running will only make things worse for you and will not save my children. I have my legal documents, and I have the evidence about my husband's death. It is time to trust that the American justice system will protect us, because hiding has not kept us safe." Tom stared at Li Wei's message for a long moment, struck by the courage it must take to choose to face an uncertain future rather than flee into a known danger. But he also knew that Li Wei's faith in the American justice system might be misplaced, especially if the corruption her husband had discovered did indeed have tentacles reaching into American institutions. "Are you sure?" Tom typed. "Once we make this choice, there's no going back. If we're wrong about who we can trust, the consequences could be terrible." Li Wei didn't hesitate in her response. "Mr. Tom, I have been running and hiding for almost a year. My children deserve better than a life lived in fear. My husband died trying to expose the truth, and if I spend the rest of my life hiding from that truth, then his death will have been meaningless. I want to fight, but I want to fight the right way, with proper legal protection and with people who understand what we are up against." As Tom read Li Wei's words, he felt something shift in his own understanding of the situation. For the past 2 weeks, he had been thinking of himself as a protector, someone shielding Li Wei and her children from external threats. But now he realized that Li Wei didn't need protection as much as she needed support, someone to stand with her as she faced whatever came next with dignity and courage. The next 45 minutes passed in a flurry of preparation. Tom helped Li Wei gather all her documents and organize them in a way that would be easy to present to federal agents. Li Wei nursed the babies and changed them into their cleanest clothes, as if preparing for an important meeting rather than a potential arrest. Tom found himself amazed by Li Wei's composure as she prepared to face an uncertain future, her movements efficient and purposeful despite the fear he could see in her eyes. When the black SUVs pulled into Tom's driveway, kicking up dust clouds that hung in the morning air, Tom and Li Wei were sitting in the living room waiting for them. Li Wei held both babies, one in each arm, while Tom sat beside her with the folder of documents they had prepared. The laptop was open on the coffee table, ready to facilitate communication if needed. Agent Martinez turned out to be a middle-aged Hispanic woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that somehow managed to be both authoritative and reassuring. She was accompanied by two other agents and a woman Tom didn't initially recognize, but who introduced herself as Amanda Chen, a translator and cultural liaison from the State Department. Mr. Harrison, Ms. Lee, Agent Martinez began, settling into a chair across from them, while her colleagues positioned themselves strategically around the room. We're here because we've been investigating the same corruption network that was responsible for your husband's death. Ms. Lee, we've been looking for you for several months, not to arrest you, but to offer you protection and to ask for your help in bringing these people to justice. Li Wei's composure finally cracked at these words, and tears began streaming down her face as she realized that the federal agents hadn't come to take her children away, but to offer the protection and support she had been afraid to hope for. Amanda Chen quickly moved to sit beside Li Wei, speaking to her in rapid Chinese while Agent Martinez explained the situation to Tom. Miss Li's husband, Chen Wei, was working with one of our financial crimes units as an informant before his death. Agent Martinez continued. He had provided us with preliminary evidence about a money laundering operation that we've now been investigating for over a year. When he was killed, we lost our primary source of information, but we also inherited a responsibility to protect his family. We've been trying to locate Miss Li ever since. Tom felt a mixture of relief and anger as he processed this information. Relief that Li Wei and her children were finally going to get the help they needed, but anger that they had spent months living in fear and danger when protection had been available all along. Why didn't you find her sooner? Tom asked, his voice sharper than he intended. She's been hiding and running for almost a year. Those babies were born in God knows what kind of conditions because their mother was afraid to seek help. Agent Martinez's expression softened. Mr. Harrison, I understand your frustration, and you're right to be angry about what this family has been through. The truth is, we didn't know Miss Li had made it to the United States until very recently. We had been working with Chinese authorities and Interpol to locate her, but the same corruption network that killed her husband had been interfering with our efforts to track her movements. Amanda Chen looked up from her conversation with Li Wei and addressed the room. Li Wei wants to know if her children will be safe if she cooperates with your investigation. She says she has information about the financial networks her husband discovered, but she won't put her babies at risk to get justice for their father. Miss Li and her children will be placed in our witness protection program immediately, Agent Martinez replied. We have safe houses equipped to handle families with small children, and we have resources to help her rebuild her life while we pursue this investigation. But I won't lie to you. The people we're investigating are dangerous, and this process may take months or even years to complete. Li Wei spoke rapidly to Amanda Chen in Chinese, her voice urgent and emotional. The translator turned back to the group and said, Li Wei says she doesn't care how long it takes or how difficult it is. She wants these people to face justice for what they did to her husband, and she wants to make sure they can never hurt another family the way they hurt hers. As the morning progressed, the details of Li Wei's future began to take shape. She would be moved to a secure location within the next few days, along with Ming and Mei. She would work with federal prosecutors to provide testimony about her husband's discoveries and her own experiences fleeing from the corruption network. In exchange, she would receive full protection, legal assistance with her asylum claim, and help establishing a new life in America. But it was the question of Tom's role in Li Wei's future that proved most complex. Agent Martinez explained that while Tom had broken no laws by providing shelter to Li Wei, his continued involvement with her case could potentially put him at risk if the corruption network learned of his identity. Harrison, you've done an extraordinary thing by helping this family, Agent Martinez said. But now that Ms. Li is under federal protection, the best thing you can do for her safety and your own is to let us handle things from here. Tom looked at Li Wei, who was listening intently as Amanda Chen translated the agent's words. When the translation was complete, Li Wei looked directly at Tom with her partially sighted eyes and spoke in careful English. Tom, you save our lives. You give us home when we have nothing. You are family to us now, always. But these people are right. We must be smart, not just brave. Using the laptop, Li Wei typed a longer message that she showed to Tom before sharing it with the agents. Tom has been more than kind to us. He has been a father to my children and a brother to me. But I want him to be safe, and I want my children to know him as they grow up. If the federal protection can keep us all safe, then that is what we must do. The arrangements that followed were both practical and emotional. Li Wei would leave with the federal agents that afternoon, taking only what was necessary for the baby's immediate needs. Tom would be given contact information for reaching Li Wei through secure channels, and there was discussion of eventual visits once the immediate danger had passed and security protocols had been established. As Li Wei packed the few possessions she had accumulated during her stay, Tom found himself struggling with emotions he hadn't expected. Over the past 2 weeks, these 3 people had become his family in ways that transcended legal definitions or blood relationships. Watching Li Wei fold the tiny clothes he had helped wash, seeing her pack the baby bottles they had shared responsibility for warming, Tom realized he was losing something precious that he might never get back. The goodbyes were brief but intense. Li Wei hugged Tom tightly, whispering thank you in both English and Chinese. She held each baby up for him to kiss, and Tom was struck by how much Ming and Mei had grown during their stay. How their faces had filled out and their eyes had become more alert and responsive. "You will see them again," Li Wei said, her voice confident despite the tears streaming down her face. "When this is over, when my children are safe, you will be part of their lives. They will know their American grandfather who gave them refuge when they had nowhere else to go." As the black SUVs pulled away from his ranch, carrying Li Wei and her babies toward an uncertain but hopefully safer future, Tom stood in his driveway, feeling simultaneously empty and fulfilled. His house would be quiet again, his routine would return to its predictable patterns, and the kitchen would no longer smell of formula and baby powder. But as Tom looked at his home, he saw it differently than he had 2 weeks ago. The guest room would always be the room where 2 Chinese babies had learned to sleep safely. The living room would always be the place where their mother had told her story and found her courage. The kitchen would always be where they had shared meals and built trust across language barriers and cultural differences. Li Wei and her children had given Tom something he hadn't expected to find again after Sarah's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own needs and desires. They had reminded him that family could be created through choice and compassion, that home was something you built with other people rather than something you simply inhabited alone. That evening, Tom called his nearest neighbor and asked if they needed help with anything. The next morning, he drove to town and volunteered at the local food bank. Within a week, he had contacted the county social services office to ask about becoming a foster parent for children in need of temporary placement. Li Wei and her children had spent only 2 weeks on Tom Harrison's ranch, but their presence had transformed not just his understanding of family, but his vision of how he wanted to spend the rest of his life. They had shown him that the most important thing he could do with the security and stability he had built was to share it with others who needed what he had to offer. The federal investigation would take 18 months to complete, and Tom would have limited contact with Li Wei during that time. But the foundation they had built during those 2 weeks of shared trust and mutual support would prove strong enough to sustain them both through the challenges ahead, and to eventually reunite them in ways that none of them could have imagined as they said goodbye on that Thursday afternoon in October. 18 months later, Tom Harrison stood in the arrival area of Denver International Airport, holding a sign that read Li Family in both English and Chinese characters that Li Wei had taught him to write during their brief but intense correspondence. His hands shook slightly as he scanned the faces of passengers emerging from the secure area, looking for 3 people who had become the most important family he never expected to have. The federal investigation had concluded successfully 3 months earlier, with 15 people arrested across 3 countries and millions of dollars in stolen assets recovered. Li Wei's testimony had been crucial to the prosecution's case, and her courage in facing cross-examination from defense attorneys, representing some of the most dangerous financial criminals in the world, had impressed even the seasoned federal prosecutors handling the case. During the 18 months of Li Wei's time in witness protection, Tom had maintained contact through carefully monitored channels. Letters had been exchanged, photos shared, and occasional phone calls arranged through federal handlers. Tom had watched Ming and Mei grow from infants to toddlers through pictures that arrived monthly, and Li Wei had shared stories of their first words, first steps, and developing personalities through letters written in the careful English she had continued to practice. But nothing had prepared Tom for the moment when he saw Li Wei emerge from the security checkpoint, walking confidently with a white cane in one hand, while Mei held her other hand. Ming was riding on her shoulders, chattering excitedly in a mixture of Chinese and English, as he pointed at everything around him. Li Wei had grown her hair long, and she moved with a confidence that Tom remembered from their early days together, but which had been overlaid with a new sense of security and purpose. The children, now nearly 2 years old, were beautiful, healthy toddlers who had clearly thrived during their time under federal protection. Ming spotted Tom first, his face breaking into a grin as he recognized the man whose photo had been prominently displayed in their temporary homes throughout their time away. "Grandpa Tom," he called out using the English phrase Li Wei had taught him. The reunion was emotional and overwhelming. Li Wei hugged Tom tightly, and he was struck by how much stronger she seemed, how the fragile young woman who had hidden in his stable had been transformed into someone who radiated resilience and determination. The children, though initially shy, quickly warmed to Tom, and within minutes Ming was demonstrating his improved English, while Mei showed off her ability to count to 10 in both languages. Li Wei's transformation was perhaps most evident in her relationship with her visual impairment. She had learned to navigate confidently with her white cane, had mastered techniques for managing daily tasks independently, and had even begun working as a translator for other Chinese families seeking asylum in the United States. The woman who had once been afraid to reveal her location was now helping other people in similar situations find safety and legal protection. "The FBI helped me understand that hiding from my husband's death was not honoring his memory," Li Wei explained as they drove from the airport to Tom's ranch. "Chen Wei died trying to expose corruption so that other people wouldn't suffer. When I help other families now, when I translate for them in court, or help them understand the legal process, I am continuing his work." The children's development during their time away had been remarkable. Ming and Mei were bilingual, speaking both Chinese and English, with the fluidity that comes naturally to young children. They had received excellent medical care, early childhood education, and had been surrounded by other families in the Witness Protection Program, giving them social interaction with children from diverse backgrounds. But perhaps most importantly, they had maintained their connection to their Chinese heritage while adapting to American culture. Li Wei had worked with cultural specialists to ensure that Ming and Mei understood their father's story and their own history, while also preparing them for life as Chinese Americans in a country that would become their permanent home. Tom had spent the 18 months of separation transforming his own life in ways that reflected the impact Li Wei and her children had had on him. He had become a certified foster parent and had provided temporary homes for 6 different children during Li Wei's absence. His ranch had been modified to accommodate families, with the guest room converted into a proper nursery, and the house child-proofed throughout. More significantly, Tom had established a non-profit organization with the settlement money Li Wei had received from the federal investigation. The Chen Wei Foundation provided emergency shelter and support services for families seeking asylum in the United States, particularly those with young children or family members with disabilities. Li Wei had insisted that Tom be the foundation's director, arguing that his experience providing sanctuary made him uniquely qualified to understand what refugee families needed most. The foundation operated out of buildings Tom had constructed on his property, including a residential facility that could house up to 6 families at a time while they navigated the asylum process. Li Wei would serve as the foundation's primary translator and cultural liaison, using her own experience to help other families understand and access available resources. As they toured the expanded facilities on Tom's ranch, Li Wei was amazed by the transformation. The simple farmhouse had been expanded to include offices, meeting rooms, and living spaces designed specifically for families with small children. The stable where Li Wei had first sought shelter had been converted into a childcare facility, and the surrounding pastures now included playgrounds and outdoor spaces where children could safely play while their parents attended legal meetings or counseling sessions. "You have built something beautiful here," Li Wei said, running her hand along the wall of the nursery that would serve as temporary home for refugee children. Chen Wei would be proud to know that his death led to something that helped so many families. The first few weeks of Li Wei's return to the ranch were devoted to re-establishing routines and helping Ming and Mei adjust to their new permanent home. The children adapted quickly, delighting in the freedom to run and play on the ranch and showing particular fascination with Tom's horses. Ming proved to be fearless around the animals, while Mei was more cautious but deeply curious about everything from feeding schedules to grooming techniques. Li Wei resumed the role she had briefly filled 18 months earlier, but now as an equal partner rather than a refugee seeking shelter. She and Tom worked together to develop programs for the foundation, drawing on both his practical experience and her professional background to create services that address the full range of needs refugee families faced. The foundation's first official residents arrived 3 months after Li Wei's return. A Somali family with 4 children who had been waiting 2 years for their asylum hearing. Tom and Li Wei worked together to welcome them, with Li Wei serving as translator while Tom helped the family's father understand American farming techniques that might help him find employment. Watching Li Wei interact with this new refugee family, Tom was struck by how naturally she had assumed the role of mentor and advocate. She understood their fears because she had lived them. She could anticipate their needs because she had experienced them. And she could offer hope because she had found safety and stability after her own period of terror and uncertainty. The children, Ming and Mei, proved to be natural ambassadors for the Foundation's mission. Despite being barely 2 years old, they seemed to understand that their home was special, that it was a place where families came when they needed help. They shared their toys willingly, attempted to communicate with children who spoke different languages, and showed the kind of unconscious acceptance of diversity that Tom wished more adults could emulate. As the Foundation grew and more families found temporary shelter on Tom's ranch, the property began to feel like a small community. Children played together, while their parents attended English classes or legal consultations. Gardens were planted with vegetables from various cultural traditions. Evening meals became multicultural affairs where families shared recipes and stories from their home countries. Li Wei's role in this community extended far beyond translation services. She had become a source of hope for women who had experienced trauma, a practical advisor for families navigating bureaucratic systems, and a living example that it was possible to rebuild a life after losing everything. Her own story, once a source of shame and fear, had become a tool for helping others understand that survival was possible and that safety could be found. The transformation of Tom's ranch from a lonely outpost where an elderly widower tended his animals into a thriving community dedicated to helping refugee families was remarkable enough. But the personal transformation of both Tom and Li Wei was perhaps even more significant. Tom had discovered that the nurturing instincts he had channeled into caring for animals could be directed toward caring for people, and that the isolation he had accepted as inevitable could be replaced by meaningful connections with individuals from around the world. Li Wei had learned that the trauma she had experienced, rather than being something to overcome and forget, could be transformed into wisdom and strength that benefited others. Her blindness, which had initially seemed like another obstacle to overcome, had become an asset in her work with other disabled refugees who needed advocates who understood the challenges they faced. 2 years after the Foundation opened, Tom stood in his kitchen preparing breakfast for Ming and Mei while Li Wei got ready for a day of testimony before a congressional committee investigating international corruption. The scene was domestic and ordinary, yet it represented something extraordinary: the creation of family and community from the most unlikely circumstances. Ming, now 4 years old, was helping Tom crack eggs while chattering about his plans to teach the newest refugee children how to ride ponies. Mei, slightly more reserved but equally enthusiastic, was setting the table with the careful precision she brought to all her tasks. Li Wei moved confidently around the kitchen, her white cane an extension of herself as she navigated between her children and her work preparing notes for her congressional testimony. This was not the family any of them had planned or expected, but it had become the family they had chosen and built together. Tom had found the children he had always wanted in Ming and Mei, and they had found a grandfather who loved them unconditionally. Li Wei had found not just safety but purpose, and her children had found stability and security that allowed them to thrive. The Chen Wei Foundation had helped more than 200 families navigate the asylum process, with a success rate that exceeded national averages by significant margins. But beyond the statistics and the official recognition the foundation had received, Tom and Li Wei had created something more personal and lasting. Proof that strangers could become family, that loss could be transformed into purpose, and that the most beautiful chapters of life often began with the most unexpected discoveries. As Tom watched Li Wei help Ming with his shoes while reviewing her congressional testimony notes, he reflected on how that morning in his stable had changed not just their lives, but the lives of hundreds of families who had found shelter and support through their work. The sound of babies crying that had stopped him in his tracks that October morning had led to the sound of children playing and laughing that now filled his home year-round. The Foundation's motto, suggested by Li Wei and approved unanimously by their board, was simple: every stranger is family waiting to be discovered. It was a philosophy born from their own experience, tested through years of practical application, and proven true by the community they had built together. That evening, as Tom tucked Ming and Mei into bed in the room that had once been empty guest space, he read them the same story he read every night. A tale Li Wei had written about a rancher who found something precious in his stable and learned that the most important things in life often come disguised as problems to be solved rather than gifts to be received. "Grandpa Tom," Ming said as Tom finished the story, "will you tell us again about the morning you found Mama in the stable?" Tom smiled and settled into the chair beside their beds, beginning the story that had become family legend, the story of how 3 strangers had found each other, and built something beautiful from circumstances none of them would have chosen, but all of them had learned to treasure. Outside their window, other families were settling in for the night in the comfortable apartments Tom and Lee Wei had built for them. Other children were being tucked into bed with stories of hope in languages from around the world, and other parents were dreaming of the safety and stability that the Chenwei Foundation had helped them find. The Montana ranch that had once echoed only with the sounds of wind and cattle now hummed with the voices of a community built on the simple premise that everyone deserved shelter, safety, and the chance to rebuild their lives. It had all started with one man's decision to open a stable door and see possibility. Instead of problems, family instead of strangers, hope instead of complications. And every morning when Tom Harrison woke up to the sounds of children laughing and playing, to Lee Wei moving confidently through their shared home, to new families arriving to begin their journeys towards safety and stability, he was reminded that the most extraordinary gifts often come wrapped in the most ordinary moments. And that family is not something you are born into, but something you choose to create with the people who need what you have to offer.